I'd like to introduce you today to a book called Redating the New Testament regarding the minority view of some scholars that all of the Gospels, including the Gospel of John, was written before 70 AD or the destruction of the temple by the Romans. First, let's look at the Orthodox position for a late date. So it's traditionally believed that the Gospel of John is the last to be written, circa 90 or 100 AD, mainly because there's a strong patristic tradition that states that John outlived everyone else. Some even think he lived into his 90s, which at that time was unheard of. Another point is that some of the early so-called church fathers, mainly Eusebius and others, cite Papias, an early 2nd century so-called church father, as the person who helped to write the Gospel of John, or his amanuensis. They point to the fact that the tradition, the patristic and early church tradition, states that John was exiled or banished outside of Palestine to a place in Ephesus, and later one of the Greek islands. And obviously most of Christendom has agreed with this view for many centuries. But last, and the reason why I think this topic is important, the Gospel of John has traditionally been known as the higher Christology gospel, used by early movements that believe that Jesus is literally God in the absolute sense of the word, which later became the Catholic Protestant position. Now, the arguments for an early date include that the same Koine or Koine Greek style is used as the synoptics, and as a result, it has a lot of Hebraic elements. In Robinson's other book, The Human Face of God, he says that nowhere in the New Testament are we closer than in the fourth gospel to the fundamental Hebraic use of sonship. Another point, manuscript Muratorian canon or manuscript dated to the early 2nd century, which details why and when the Gospels might have been written. And when it comes to the Gospel of John, it mentions that Andrew, one of the apostles, was still alive at the time. And one of the reasons is internal evidence. So he says that it bears all the marks of having been shaped in Jewish Christian circles in Judea, very much in touch with the synagogue, and prior to the rebellion of 66 AD, which led obviously to the destruction in 70 AD. It's believed Jerusalem came under Roman siege for at least 3 years or so before it was destroyed. So again, this would question the traditional belief that John was outside of Judea, Palestine, while he was writing the gospel. Other points, internal evidence is the Jew-Gentile mission. Robinson says, it certainly presupposes a milieu where concentration on the presentation of Jesus as the truth and fullness of Israel was the all-absorbing task of Christian apologetic. Of no conceivable milieu was this true after 70, except in isolated pockets of Ebionite Christianity, which still saw Christianity as tied to the Jewish manner of living, the Nazarenes of the 12th benediction. And if anything, says Robinson, and if anything can be said with certainty of the fourth gospel, it is that John was no Judaizer or preacher of a narrow Jewish exclusivism. Robinson also points to the internal evidence that there's no discussion in any of the gospels, for that matter, or any allusions even or implications that the temple was destroyed. He writes, well, there are many things upon which in the absence of evidence it would be prudent to suspend judgment. There's nothing that suggests or presupposes that the temple is already destroyed or that Jerusalem is in ruins, signs of which calamity and of the difference in outlook it engendered are inescapably present in any Jewish or Christian literature that can with certainty be dated in the period 70 to 100 AD. And one of the proof texts Robinson uses is John 2:20, where some translations render the Greek there as the temple being under construction as opposed to already finished. Now, this is backed by an account in the Wars of Josephus that the temple was finished in the early 60s or just before the siege that started around 66 AD and led to the destruction. He also points to John 5:1. There is a place a rare present tense used by the writer of John. Robinson believes this points to the fact that the temple was still standing. So his timetable in the book Redating the New Testament looks something like this. So from 30 to 50 AD, formation of the Johannine tradition and proto-gospel in Jerusalem. 50 to 55 is the first edition of our present gospel in Asia Minor. And he has 60 to 65, the epistles or the letters of John, also being written. And then sometime after 65, it takes a final form with perhaps added prologue and epilogue. Now, one thing about Robinson is that he was a liberal scholar in that he denied many of the miracles. He denied the virgin birth, for example. So we have to be careful with how we read him. He believes that the epilogue especially was added much later, although he still believes that John, the apostle, did write all of these accounts, the letters and the gospel. But the real Orthodox agenda, I believe, has to do with the last point I cited, being the so-called higher Christology, that the Gospel of John has been attributed by Jesus is God movements. Most converts to Christianity, certainly in my case, are introduced to the Bible as a whole with the Gospel of John. And this is done by especially evangelical groups. This is why the Gospel has been popularly coined the spiritual gospel. So this is the New Encyclopedia Britannica. Because of its special theological character, the Gospel according to John was considered in ancient times to be the spiritual gospel, wielding a profound and lasting influence on the development of early Christian doctrine. As a result of this profound and lasting influence from even ancient times, the new convert or the novice believer is immediately confronted by a kind of mystic symbolism and repeated emphasis on the father-son relationship, which in Catholic Protestant circles is taught as being the incarnation of a God the Son. Most Christians come away, I believe, with an erroneous picture of who Jesus is, let alone the one God of Israel. So the agenda being that if the gospel is the last one to have been written, is the last one to give us the full character, the full, quote, nature of who Jesus was, it would make sense that John takes priority over all the other gospels, which on its face, it's a very bad way of doing Bible study because you're basically pitting one account of the same event and people and person of Christ against the other accounts. But nonetheless, the theme throughout John, if you look at it in harmony with the other Gospels, is of the human Son of God. So there's the father-son relationship, which is prominent throughout. John talks about the human Son of God, for example. John 20:31, the reader having to believe that this man is the Messiah, the Son of God. And we can compare that to what John later says in his letters about the importance of believing that Jesus came in the flesh. In other words, that he was a real human being.